Vivian Caldwell picked up her wedding bouquet and walked to the window and threw it into the mud. She didn't throw it hard. She just opened her fingers and let it fall, all those weeks of pressing lavender into ivory ribbon. All those careful knots she'd tied by lamplight and watched it land in the yard below without making a sound. Inside the church, her sister was wearing her dress. Her sister was holding her place. Her sister was about to speak her vows to a man who had never once laid eyes on either of them. And every single person in that Virginia town had looked the other way and let it happen. If this story speaks to your heart, subscribe to our channel and follow every part to the very end. And drop a comment me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The bouquet hit the mud and stayed there. Vivian turned away from the window. She pressed her back against the wall of the narrow side corridor and listened to the bells and told herself, the way she had been telling herself things for 26 years, that she was not going to cry. Not here. Not in front of a church full of people who had already decided she didn't matter enough to fight for. She'd cried exactly once over this, the night her father told her. She'd gone upstairs, sat on the edge of her bed, and let herself have 10 minutes. Then she'd washed her face, gone back downstairs, and started calculating what her life was going to look like without this marriage in it. That was how Vivian Caldwell operated. You got your 10 minutes. Then you got practical. The problem was that she hadn't figured out the practical part yet. 3 days, that was all the warning she'd had. 3 days before the ceremony. Her father had called her into his study, the same study where she'd taught herself accounting as a child because she had nothing else to do, and numbers. At least, behaved predictably, and he'd been standing at the window with his back to her. That posture, she'd known that posture her entire life. It meant whatever was coming, he didn't want to watch her face when it arrived. Rosalie will be taking your place at the ceremony, he'd said. It's been decided. Vivian had stood very still. Decided by whom? He'd turned then, and she'd seen what she always saw, not cruelty. Not even coldness, but that particular variety of indifference that was somehow worse than either. Nathaniel Hawthorne is a serious man. He needs a wife who will make an impression. Vivian, you know you're not. You're not what men like him are looking for. And what are men like him looking for? Something presentable. He'd said it like he was apologizing for the weather. Something that reflects well. Rosalie understands how to be seen. Vivian had looked at her father, this man she had kept afloat for 4 years. Whose accounts she balanced, whose creditors she managed. Whose letters she wrote because his penmanship was poor and his grasp of interest rates was worse, and she had understood. With perfect clarity, that none of that had ever counted. Not once. Not to him, I understand. She'd gone upstairs. She'd had her 10 minutes. She'd come back down and said nothing further. Because there was nothing left to say. The dress had already been altered for Rosalie by morning. Now Vivian stood in the corridor and listened to the murmur of 100 guests and thought about what comes next. She had $32 saved in a tin box under her floorboard. She had skills nobody wanted to pay for. She had a family who had just demonstrated, with complete clarity, exactly what her value to them was. She had no plan. That was the part that sat in her chest like a stone. Not the humiliation. She'd had years of practice with humiliation. The low-grade daily variety that came from being the plain one. The quiet one. The one who managed everything and was credited for nothing. That she could absorb. What she couldn't absorb was the absence of a next step. Vivian Caldwell always had a next step. You ought to go home, said a voice beside her. Martha Webb. Of course it was Martha Webb. The woman had the instincts of a carrion bird. She appeared wherever something was dying and positioned herself for the best view. People don't know where to look, Martha continued. With the particular satisfaction of someone delivering news they've been saving. You standing here just makes it awkward. Then they should look at the ceremony, Vivian said. That's the customary focus at a wedding. You always did have a sharp tongue for a plain girl. Vivian looked at her. Looked at her fully, the way she rarely allowed herself to. because it tended to make people uncomfortable, and she'd spent most of her life managing other people's comfort. And you've always had a great many opinions for a woman nobody asked. Martha's mouth went thin. She moved away. Vivian turned back to the door. She was not going to feel good about that exchange. She wasn't going to feel much of anything right now. That was the only way through. Just stand here. Just breathe. Just wait for whatever was going to happen next. Because something was going to happen. It always did. And she needed to be standing upright when it did. The murmur on the other side of the door changed. She felt it before she understood it, a shift in the quality of sound. A collective intake, the particular silence that happens when something unexpected walks into a room full of people who thought they knew what to expect. He had arrived. Vivian pressed her palm flat against the wall. Inside that church, she heard boots on stone, steady and unhurried. Not performing for anyone, not adjusting their pace for the audience. She had spent her whole life reading footsteps. These ones said, "I know exactly where I'm going, and I'm not in any particular hurry to get there. Because nothing in this room is going to change my mind." She held her breath. Then his voice came through the door. Low and level, and carrying the way voices did when they belonged to men who'd never needed to raise them. "Where is Vivian Caldwell?" The silence that followed was extraordinary. Vivian's hand dropped from the wall. She looked at the door. She thought, well, she pushed it open and walked in. Every head turned. She was aware of all of them in the way you become aware of everything when your heartbeat is the loudest sound in your own skull. Martha Webb near the back, color rising in her face. The Henderson cousins, mouths slightly open. Reverend Aldous at the altar with the expression of a man whose theology had not prepared him for this particular circumstance. Her mother in the front pew, one gloved hand pressed to her sternum. And Rosalie. Rosalie at the altar in the ivory dress. In the dress with the pearl buttons Vivian had chosen herself. In the dress that had been altered by mourning and her face. When she saw Vivian walk through that door was the first genuinely unguarded expression Vivian had seen from her sister in years. Not triumph, not guilt, something between them. Something that might have been the beginning of understanding, arriving too late to matter. And beside her, slightly away from her, which said everything, stood Nathaniel Hawthorne. He was not what Vivian had built from her father's descriptions and the solicitor's formal letter. She'd expected someone older, more armored, a man who wore his money the way some men did. Like a warning. Instead, she found a man in his late 30s. Broad-shouldered, plain-faced in a way that suggested he'd made his peace with that a long time ago. His suit was good but not showy. His hands, she noticed, were the hands of a man who worked, and his eyes, gray as November creek water, found her immediately. Not after searching. Not after scanning the room, immediately. Like he'd known exactly where to look. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, "Miss Caldwell." Not a recognition. Like he'd been expecting her specifically. Vivian walked toward him. She was aware of her gray dress, 3 years old. Her hair, half-pinned. Her empty hands. She was aware of every person watching her cross that church floor. Aware that they all knew to varying degrees and with varying amounts of shame exactly what had been done to her. She walked anyway, spine straight, pace even, eyes forward. She stopped a few feet from the altar. "Mr. Hawthorne," she said. "I was told," he said, and his voice was perfectly level, "that you had taken ill and couldn't attend. I'm in excellent health, I can see that." Something moved across his face, not amusement. Exactly. But something adjacent to it, something approving. "I'm glad to hear it." Rosalie stepped forward. "Nathaniel." "Please, if you'll just let me, Miss Rosalie." He said it quietly. Without looking at her. "I mean no disrespect. But I'd ask you to give me a moment." Rosalie stopped. Their father rose from his seat. Edward Caldwell in his good coat. His authority reassembling itself around him, like a garment he'd briefly set down. "Now see here, this arrangement was made in good faith. Hawthorne and Rosalie is perfectly—" "Mr. Caldwell," The temperature in Nathaniel's voice didn't change by a single degree. But something under it hardened the way ground hardens before a frost. I traveled 4 days to honor an agreement. I'd like to know plainly whether that agreement has been honored in return. The agreement was for a Caldwell daughter. The agreement, Nathaniel said, was for Vivian, by writing. He paused. I wrote to her specifically. She wrote back, we have corresponded for 8 months. The woman standing in front of me right now is the first time I've seen her face. But I know her mind considerably better than that. He looked at Edward Caldwell with the particular steadiness of a man who has no social debts to manage and therefore nothing to lose by being direct. I don't believe you made this substitution in good faith. Sir, I believe you made it because you thought I wouldn't notice the difference. I want you to understand that I noticed. The church was completely silent. Vivian stood in the middle of it and felt something strange happening in her chest, not quite hope. Because she'd learned to be careful with hope, but something that had been sitting very still for a very long time suddenly shifting position. Nathaniel turned back to her. Miss Caldwell, he said. And his voice was different now. Still even, but something underneath it had changed an attention. A directness that felt almost physical. I recognize this is not the morning you expected. I recognize I'm a stranger to you and you have no reason to trust my judgment. But I'd like to ask you plainly, in front of everyone here, whether you'd be willing to proceed as we originally agreed. Vivian looked at him. She looked at the gray eyes and the work-worn hands and the set of a man's jaw that said he had decided something and was not going to be argued out of it. She thought about $32 in a tin box. She thought about a bouquet in the mud. She thought about 10 minutes. And then getting practical. Mr. Hawthorne, she said. I don't know you. You don't. I don't know if you're a good man. That's a fair assessment of the situation. I don't know what this is. Neither do I, he said. But I know I came a long way to meet the woman who wrote those letters. And I haven't managed that yet. He paused. I'd like to. The silence held. Then Vivian said, all right. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. But it didn't shake. I'll proceed. The ceremony was the strangest hour of Vivian Caldwell's life. Reverend Aldous performed it with the shell-shocked efficiency of a man who had decided the Lord would simply have to adjudicate the specifics later. Rosalie was escorted to a pew by their mother, who moved with the rigid composure of someone already composing explanatory letters in her head. Their father sat with his arms crossed and his eyes on the floor. Vivian stood at the altar in her gray dress and spoke the words when prompted. Nathaniel stood beside her and spoke his. Their voices rose together in that old stone church, and not one person in the room made a sound. When it was done, Nathaniel offered his hand. She took it. His grip was firm and unhurried, not possessive, not ceremonial. Just solid. The grip of a man who, when he committed to something, committed all the way. They walked out into Virginia sunlight together. Her father caught them in the yard. He was slightly winded. He'd moved fast to cut them off before the carriage, and his dignity was mostly absent, which was unusual enough that Vivian noticed it. He took hold of her arm. Not rough, but not asking. A word. Nathaniel's hand was resting at the small of her back lightly. Practically a gesture of navigation rather than possession. It went very still, sir. Just the one word. But the quality of it. Edward ignored him. He looked at Vivian. And what was in his face wasn't the coldness she expected. It was something more complicated, the look of a man who has just realized, too late, that he fundamentally miscalculated something. You have embarrassed this family today. She hasn't done anything today. Mr. Caldwell, Nathaniel said, and his voice was pleasant in the way that certain very cold mornings are pleasant, clear and clean, and with edges you don't notice until you've already cut yourself on them. I made a decision. Your daughter accepted it. Everything that happened in that church is on my account, not hers. He stepped forward, not aggressive, just present, solidly between Edward and Vivian in a way that required no commentary. Edward's hand dropped from her arm. And I'd be grateful if you didn't touch my wife again without asking. The word landed differently than Vivian expected. Wife. Not heavy, not strange, just accurate. Edward stared at Nathaniel Hawthorne with the expression of a man encountering something his entire life experience had failed to prepare him for. Then he looked at Vivian, and for just a moment, under the bluster and the calculation, she saw something that might have been regret. She didn't reach for it. You always did make things difficult, he said. Yes, Vivian agreed. I did. She turned and walked to the carriage. They rode in silence for the first quarter mile. Not uncomfortable, more the silence of two people who have just done something large and irreversible and are giving each other room to absorb it. Nathaniel sat across from her with his hat on his knee and his legs extended. And Vivian sat with her hands in her lap and looked out at the Virginia countryside moving past. And neither of them spoke until the church steeple disappeared behind the tree line. Then Vivian said, "You mentioned you read the financial reports." "Every page. My father sent those as his own work." "Your father," Nathaniel said, "uses a comma splice in nearly every sentence. You don't." The handwriting was different, too. He looked at her steadily. "I manage a great deal of correspondence. I pay attention to how people write. And more importantly, how they think." Vivian absorbed this. "He never knew you'd noticed, I expect not. He would have been furious, I expect so." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but the territory near one. "Those reports were genuinely excellent, Mrs. Hawthorne. The Eastern irrigation restructuring in particular. I've been looking at a similar problem on my own property for 2 years and hadn't found a solution that satisfied me." Vivian sat forward slightly. "What's the nature of the flooding?" "Spring thaw. Every year. Ruins the first planting along the eastern boundary." "What's your soil composition like?" "Heavy clay?" "Significant clay content, yes." "Then you haven't tried a fallow reservoir system." It wasn't a question. She could tell from how he'd framed the problem. "I haven't. You redirect the melt drainage into the lowest field. Let it sit fallow. Every third season you lose one field's output on rotation. But you capture the water for summer dry months, and you stop losing your edge planting to saturation. Net positive over a 5-year cycle. Significant net positive if your summer dry period runs more than 6 weeks." Nathaniel looked at her. Looked at her the way she was beginning to understand. He looked at things he found genuinely interesting with a quality of complete attention. Nothing held back, nothing performed. "How long did it take you to work that out?" he asked. "Just now," she said. "But I've been thinking about a variation of this problem since last spring." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with a straightforwardness that she was starting to recognize as simply how he operated, "Mrs. Hawthorne, I think this marriage is going to be considerably more useful than I anticipated." "You thought it would be useful going in?" "I thought it would be practical," he said. "I'm revising upward." Vivian looked back out the window. She did not smile, but the thing in her chest that had shifted in the church shifted again. A little further. They stopped that night at a coaching inn. In separate rooms. He'd arranged it that way, she discovered. Before they'd even left the churchyard, had sent a rider ahead with instructions. He made no comment about the arrangement and expected no thanks for it. Which was precisely why she was grateful. She lay on a narrow bed in a clean room and stared at the ceiling and thought. She thought about her father's face when Nathaniel said wife. She thought about Rosalie in the pew with her hands folded and that unguarded expression that had lasted only a second before her composure returned. She thought about Martha Webb and sharp tongues and plain girls. She thought about 26 years of being the one who kept everything running and was credited for nothing. She thought about a man who had noticed different handwriting, who had read 8 months of letters and decided, on the basis of how someone thought, that she was worth 4 days of travel. She'd never once in her life been valued for how she thought. She slept better than she had in months. She didn't examine that too carefully. In the morning, he was already in the common room when she came down. Coffee in hand, a sheaf of papers spread on the table in front of him. He glanced up when she sat across from him. Then he went back to his papers. She ate her toast. She thought about drainage channels. After a while, he said, "Without looking up, I should tell you something about Harrow Hill before we arrive. All right. It's not in the condition I'd like it to be." He set the papers down. He always did that when he had something to say directly. He stopped everything else. She was already learning his patterns. "I've improved it significantly since I took it on. But there are people managing sections of the estate who've been there long enough to confuse longevity with authority. They won't be welcoming to changes. You're telling me I'll face opposition. I'm telling you it's a real place with real problems and real people who've decided how things work." He looked at her evenly. "I didn't want you arriving with false expectations." Vivian looked at him across the table. "I grew up managing a household my father believed he was running. I am accustomed to doing genuine work in the background of men who are convinced they're in charge. Opposition from people who underestimate me isn't a new experience." "Mr. Hawthorne, Nathaniel." She paused. "Nathaniel," he nodded once. "Then I reckon we understand each other." They traveled for 4 days. Through small Virginia towns and over the Blue Ridge and into Kentucky, where the distances between things stretched out and the sky opened up in a way Vivian hadn't anticipated. A physical sensation, like a hand pressing on your chest, your whole life finally lifting away. She'd spent 26 years in a place where everyone knew her family's business and had opinions about her face. Out here nobody knew her name. She found to her own surprise that she liked it. They talked in the carriage, not to fill silence, neither of them had that habit, but in the way of people discovering that their minds are compatible, which is its own form of intimacy, and in some ways a more reliable one. He told her about Harrow Hill, about the land which was good and had been chronically squandered, about the systems that had calcified over years of absentee management, about a man named Coleman who oversaw the Western operations and who Nathaniel described with careful neutrality as set in his methods. She asked questions. Specific ones about acreage and water access and what the previous owner had planted and why the east boundary flooded. He answered all of them directly, without hedging, without the slight downward adjustment that men made when they were deciding how technical to get with a woman. He just answered. On the 3rd day they stopped at a creek to rest the horses, and Vivian sat on a flat rock and watched the water and said, "Without planning to, I used to think there was something wrong with me." Nathaniel, standing a few feet away, turned. "Because I couldn't make them see it," she said. "What I could do. I thought if I worked harder or explained it differently or found some way to make it visible enough." She stopped, looked at the water. "I spent years trying to be worth noticing, and it never worked. And eventually I started to wonder if the problem was the thing itself." He was quiet for a moment. "My father told me I'd never amount to anything," he said. "Younger son, no inheritance." He said it like it was a law of nature. He looked at the creek. "I've spent 20 years proving him wrong, which is it's a peculiar way to build a life when you reckon with it. Everything I've built, I've half built to show a dead man he was wrong about me." Vivian looked at him. "At least there was something to build," she said. "At least it was visible. What I was good at, it wasn't the kind of thing you could point to." "The irrigation report was pretty visible," he said. She almost laughed. It startled her, the sudden nearness of it. "I suppose it was," she said. He looked at her with that quality of attention she was coming to know. "For what it's worth, I never thought there was something wrong with you. I thought there was something wrong with every person who didn't look twice." Vivian looked back at the water. "That's a true thing to say," she said carefully. "I try not to bother with kind for its own sake," he said. "Wastes everyone's time." She believed him. That was the part that surprised her most. She simply believed him. Harrow Hill appeared on a gray afternoon. Rain smell in the air, the road muddy from the previous night's storm. Vivian's first impression was not the size of the estate. Though it was considerable main house, 2 large barns, outbuildings, fenced pasture stretching in 3 directions. Her first impression was the silence that fell over the yard when their carriage came through the gate. Not the comfortable silence of an empty place, the watchful silence of people who have stopped what they were doing to assess something new. A man emerged from the main house, large, red-faced, wearing authority the way men did when they'd held it long enough to stop remembering it was given rather than earned. He looked at Nathaniel first. "Hawthorne, didn't expect you for another week." "Plans changed," Nathaniel said. "Coleman, this is Mrs. Hawthorne, my wife." Coleman's eyes moved to Vivian. She had been assessed like this before the quick, comprehensive evaluation that concluded she wasn't worth further attention in approximately 4 seconds. Coleman did it in 3. "Welcome us," he said. The courtesy was present. The warmth was not. "Thank you," Vivian said pleasantly. She was already looking past him. At the barn, the fencing. The 3 horses standing listless in the far pasture. At the edge of the eastern field, just visible from where she stood, the flattened crop. The dark soil that held water wrong. The drainage ditch that ran at the wrong angle for the grade of the land. She started counting. She couldn't help it. It was just how her mind worked. Coleman turned back to Nathaniel and began talking a fence dispute with a neighbor. Something about a delivery that had arrived short. Vivian stepped to the side and studied the land, and ran numbers, and thought about what she was going to need to know, and who she was going to need to speak with, and what she was going to find when she did. "Are you the new Mrs.?" She turned. A girl of maybe 16 stood in the doorway of the main house, looking at Vivian with the frank curiosity of someone who hadn't yet learned to disguise it. There was something refreshing about it. "I am," Vivian said. "I'm Ruth." She looked Vivian up and down openly. "You look tired. 4 days in a carriage." "Yes." "And after that, I'd like to see the account books." Ruth blinked. "The estate accounts," Vivian said. "Expenditures. Crop yields, income records, wherever they're kept." Ruth glanced over at Coleman, still talking. Still not paying them any attention, then back at Vivian. Something was shifting behind the girl's eyes, a recalculation. "Mr. Briggs keeps those," she said carefully. "He's the estate manager. Is he here today?" "Yes." "Ma'am." "Good." Vivian looked at the eastern field one more time. "Tea first. Then Mr. Briggs." Ruth studied her for a moment longer. Then she smiled wide and genuine and a little delighted. The smile of someone who has been waiting for something interesting to happen and has just spotted it arriving. "Yes, ma'am. Right this way." That night, after the house had gone quiet, Vivian sat at the desk in her room and went through the first 2 years of Harrow Hill's estate accounts by lamplight. It took 3 hours. The land was good, Nathaniel was right about that. Well situated, capable, with the bones of something genuinely productive underneath the mismanagement. But the mismanagement was significant and specific in a way that, by the second ledger, stopped looking like incompetence. Expenditures that didn't correspond to any work she could identify. Line items that repeated with suspicious regularity the same vendors. The same amounts, quarter after quarter, with no corresponding output in the yield records. Contracts she hadn't seen in full yet, but whose terms, visible even in their summarized form, ran heavily in favor of the vendor. Coleman's name was threaded through all of it. She sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a long time. Then she took out a clean sheet of paper and began to write. Columns of figures, questions she needed answered, records she needed to see, the shape of something that, if her instincts were right, and they were almost always right, was going to be considerably uglier than simple negligence. She had come here as a stranger. She had arrived with no status, no history, no allies except a 16-year-old girl who smiled like something interesting had finally happened. She was surrounded by people who had looked at her and seen a decorative addition to a household that already knew how it worked. She had done harder things than this. She picked up her pen and wrote until the lamp guttered. Down the hall, Nathaniel Hawthorne sat at his desk and did not read his correspondence. He'd been looking at the same letter for half an hour. He was thinking about a woman on a flat rock beside a creek, saying, "I used to think there was something wrong with me," in the voice of someone who had metabolized that particular pain so completely. It had become simply weather-noted. Endured, not worth complaint. He was thinking about her walking through that church door. Gray dress, half-pinned hair, empty hands, the straightest spine he'd ever seen on a person who had every reason to fold. He was thinking about the way her voice had changed when she got into the irrigation problem, the way everything else fell away, and she was just herself. Entirely, working something out with her whole mind, and how watching it had felt like watching a door open into a room that had been locked a long time. He thought, "I made the right call." He thought, "She is going to turn this place inside out." He thought, "I hope I am worth the trouble I have just added to her life." He set the letter down. He went to the window and looked out at the dark Kentucky land, his land. The land he'd built from someone else's ruin, and he reckoned that tomorrow morning, things at Harrow Hill were going to start changing. He reckoned Coleman wasn't going to like it one bit. He reckoned that wasn't going to stop her. He went to bed. Outside, the lamp in Vivian's window burned until nearly dawn. The lamp had burned down to nothing by the time Vivian set her pen down. She didn't remember deciding to stop. She just looked up and realized the room had gone from dark to darker. The wick guttered out, and her hand had cramped somewhere around the third hour without her noticing. She stretched her fingers, looked at the pages spread across the desk, and counted what she had. 14 discrepancies in 2 years of accounts. Not 14 errors. Errors were random, they scattered. They corrected themselves. They reflected the natural disorder of a busy operation. What Vivian had found was not random. What she had found was consistent. The same vendors appearing every quarter. The same inflated line items. The same pattern of expenditure that went out and never, in any yield record she could locate, came back as anything she could identify. 14 discrepancies, and every single one of them ran through Coleman. She stacked the ledgers carefully, set her notes on top, and went to bed. She lay in the dark and told herself she needed more information before she said anything. That she was new here, that she didn't yet know the full picture, that there could be explanations she wasn't aware of. Arrangements that predated Nathaniel's ownership, legitimate contracts that simply looked odd on paper. She told herself all of it, and she believed approximately none of it. And she slept 4 hours and woke before dawn, with the numbers still running behind her eyes. By the time Ruth appeared in the kitchen doorway, Vivian was already at the table with a fresh pot of coffee and the second year of accounts open in front of her. Ruth stopped in the doorway, stared, then walked to the stove and started the fire without a word, which Vivian appreciated considerably. "How long has Coleman been here?" Vivian asked, without looking up. Ruth was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of someone who didn't know the answer, but the quiet of someone deciding how much of the answer to give. "Long as I've been here," she finally said. 7 years. Maybe more. He was here when Mr. Hawthorne bought the place, and Briggs? The estate manager? Mr. Briggs does what Mr. Coleman tells him. Ruth said it flatly, with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone who has observed a thing long enough that it stopped being opinion and became simply fact. Everybody here does, more or less. Except Mr. Hawthorne. Of course. But Mr. Hawthorne's not always here. Vivian looked up. How often is he away? 2-3 months at a stretch sometimes. He's got business in Louisville, and the stock buying takes him east in the fall. Ruth set a cup in front of Vivian and poured without asking. Coleman runs things when he's gone. Vivian looked back at the ledger. 2 to 3 months at a stretch, and Coleman had been here 7 years. She thought about water finding its own level, about how much could shift in 3 months if the right person was paying attention and the wrong person wasn't looking. "Ruth," she said carefully, "I want to ask you something. And I want you to know that whatever you tell me stays between us." Ruth looked at her with eyes that were considerably older than 16. "Yes, ma'am." In your time here, have you ever heard any of the field hands talk about the contracts? The vendor agreements? Ruth was quiet again. This time the quiet was longer. I heard Jimmy Watts say once, she said slowly, that the seed delivery was short by a quarter and he was told to sign for the full amount anyway. And he did because Coleman told him to. She paused. I heard that. I don't know what it means. Vivian knew exactly what it meant. Thank you, she said. She closed the ledger. She had enough to start. The question was how to start it without tipping her hand, before she was ready, without warning Coleman that someone had noticed. Without giving him time to shift records or move numbers or do any of the dozen things that people in his position did when they felt the ground moving under them. She needed to be careful. She needed to be systematic. And she needed at some point to tell Nathaniel. That last part was the one she kept circling. She had been married 4 days. She was sitting in a house she didn't know. In a state she'd never visited, with a man she was still learning. About to tell him that the person he'd trusted for 7 years had likely been stealing from him in plain sight for most of that time. She didn't know how he'd take it. She didn't know if he'd believe her. She didn't know if he was the kind of man who received information about his own failures, even failures that weren't his fault, with grace or with defensiveness. She'd known men of both kinds. She'd been managed by them her whole life. She thought about 4 days in a carriage, about a man who said things plainly and expected the same in return. About the way he'd stepped between her and her father at churchyard without making it a performance. She picked up her pen and her notes and went to find him. He was in the stable yard, which she discovered after checking the study and the front parlor, following the sound of his voice to the side door that opened toward the barns. He was standing with a man she didn't recognize, wiry, weathered, with the unhurried manner of someone who worked with horses for a living, and they were examining a fence line with the focused attention of two people who cared about the same thing. Nathaniel looked up when she came through the door. Mrs. Hawthorne. He didn't look surprised to see her. He looked the way he generally looked, which was like he was taking in information and filing it without commentary. This is Tom Reardon. He manages the horse stock. Tom Reardon touched the brim of his hat. Ma'am, Mr. Reardon, she said, then to Nathaniel. When you have a moment, I'd like to speak with you. Something in her voice told him it wasn't small. She could see him register it, a slight shift in how he was standing. A quality of attention that redirected. Tom, give us a few minutes. Reardon nodded and walked away without curiosity, which Vivian noted with approval. She waited until he was out of easy earshot, then handed Nathaniel the notes she'd been carrying. He looked at the top page. Then he looked at her. Up all night. I was up late, she said. I found some things in the accounts that I want to show you. I want to be clear that I may be missing context. I'm new here and there may be arrangements I don't know about. But I'd rather bring this to you too early than too late. He took the notes and read. He read the way he did everything completely, without interruption, giving it his full attention. He didn't make sounds or shift his expression. He just read. She watched his hands, which stayed still, and his jaw, which didn't. When he finished, he looked up. How long did this take you to find? He asked. 3 hours. He looked back at the notes, then back at her. I've had Briggs review these accounts twice in the last year. Briggs reports to Coleman, Vivian said carefully. The silence that followed was the kind that happens when a true thing lands in the space between two people, and neither of them is ready to look at it directly yet. Coleman's been with this property 7 years, Nathaniel said. Not defensive, she was grateful for that. He said it the way you'd state a fact that was currently complicating things. I know, she said. That's part of what makes this difficult. She paused. I'd like to see the vendor contracts, the originals. And I'd like to speak with some of the field supervisors directly, not through Briggs. She met his eyes. Before anyone knows I'm asking. Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment. You've been here less than 24 hours, he said. Yes. And you found this in 3 hours. The pattern wasn't hidden well. It was hidden from people who weren't looking for it. She held his gaze. I was looking for it. It's what I do. He studied her with that quality of attention she was coming to know, full and unguarded, and making no attempt to seem like anything other than what it was. All right, he said. I'll get you the contracts. I'll introduce you to the field supervisors, as my wife wanting to understand the property. And I'll keep Coleman occupied. That's all I need. Vivian, she realized it was the first time he'd used her given name. It landed simply, like it belonged. If you're right about this, and from what I'm reading, I think you might be, this is going to be an ugly situation to manage. I know. Coleman has allies here. People who've benefited from how things have been running. I know that too, and you still want to proceed. She looked at him steadily. Mr. Hawthorne, Nathaniel. She paused. I spent 4 years making your estate profitable from 3 states away. I would very much like to make it profitable from inside it. Whatever that requires. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he said, I'll get you the contracts. He went back inside. Vivian turned and looked at the eastern field, at the flattened crop and the waterlogged edge and the drainage ditch running wrong. And she thought, all right then. She thought, let's begin. She had no idea, standing there in the pale Kentucky morning, how fast things were about to move. Coleman found her that afternoon. She was in the second barn, speaking with a field supervisor named Elias, who was 40 years old, and had the careful manner of a man accustomed to being overheard. They'd been talking about the spring planting specifically, about why 2 of the eastern plots had consistently underperformed for 3 years running, and Elias had been answering her questions with the deliberate thoughtfulness of someone who had answers he'd never been asked for before. When the barn door opened and Coleman walked in, he took in the scene. Elias, Vivian, the open ledger she was holding. His face didn't exactly, but something behind his eyes did. Mrs. Hawthorne, he said. The courtesy was still present. The warmth was still absent. Didn't realize you were out here. I'd have been happy to arrange a proper tour. That's very kind, Vivian said. Elias has been explaining the field rotation to me. He's been very helpful. Elias, she noticed, had gone carefully still. Elias is a good worker, Coleman said, and there was something in the way he said it, a pause before good. A wait on worker that was not quite a warning but was constructed from the same materials. He's got a full afternoon ahead of him, though. Plenty to do, of course. Vivian smiled pleasantly. I'll let you get back to it, Elias. Thank you. Elias nodded. He left with the movement of a man who was grateful to be released, and Vivian didn't blame him for it. Coleman waited until the footsteps faded. Then he turned to her with the expression of a man who had decided to be direct while maintaining the surface appearance of courtesy. Mrs. Hawthorne, I want to make sure we start off right. This estate runs on systems that have been built over years. Tight systems. You'd want to get to know the place before jumping into the particulars. That's very reasonable advice, Vivian said. The accounts, the contracts, there's a lot of background that makes those numbers make sense. Things that aren't obvious on paper, I imagine so. Briggs is the man to walk you through it. He knows every line item. I'll be sure to speak with him, she said. She closed the ledger she'd been holding and tucked it under her arm. Thank you, Mr. Coleman. I appreciate you looking out for me. She walked past him and out of the barn. Behind her she heard nothing. No footsteps, no movement. Just a man standing very still in a barn doing the math. She kept walking. She found Nathaniel in the study before supper and told him about the encounter in 3 sentences. He listened. He didn't say I told you so, which she appreciated, since she hadn't needed to be told. He'll move quickly now, Nathaniel said. I know. We need to be faster. She set 3 pages on his desk, figures she'd compiled that afternoon. A summary of what she suspected and what she still needed to confirm. I need the original seed contracts from the last 3 years. The actual signed documents, not the ledger summaries. Where would those be? Briggs' office. Locked cabinet, I'd expect. Right side, from the way he kept glancing at it when I was in there earlier. Nathaniel looked at her. You were in Briggs' office. I introduced myself. I asked about the property history. He was nervous. She paused. The cabinet was locked and he put his hand on it when I walked close. You were looking for the cabinet. I was being friendly, Vivian said pleasantly. And I happened to notice the cabinet. Something moved across Nathaniel's face that was fighting with itself to become a smile. It mostly succeeded, Vivian. I need those contracts. I'll get them tonight. If possible. Before he has a chance to speak with Briggs, Nathaniel stood up. You reckon Coleman's already spoken with him? I reckon Coleman was speaking with him before I cleared the barn door, she said. So yes, tonight he went. She sat in the study and waited and thought about the shape of what she was building. It had to be complete before she showed it to anyone outside this room. It had to be airtight, the kind of case where the numbers spoke for themselves, where the only possible response was acknowledgement, not argument. Incomplete evidence gave men like Coleman room to maneuver. He'd had 7 years to build relationships in this county. He had allies and favors, and the accumulated social capital of someone who had been the authority in a community for long enough that people had built their sense of normalcy around him. Vivian had been here one day. She needed to be 3 times as thorough. Nathaniel returned 40 minutes later with a leather folder. He set it on the desk in front of her without ceremony. 3 years of original contracts. He keeps a separate file. She opened it. She read for 20 minutes. Then she sat back in her chair and let out a long, quiet breath. How bad, Nathaniel said. The seed contracts alone show a 22% markup over market rate. Paid to a vendor whose address is a post office box in Louisville. She looked up. I'd want to confirm this, but I believe if you looked into who owns that post office box, you'd find a name connected to Coleman. Nathaniel was very still. The timber contract from last fall, she continued, shows payment for 800 board feet that the yield records indicate were never delivered. And the fencing expenditure from spring before last, she turned a page. The invoice is signed by Briggs, but the handwriting on the delivery confirmation is the same as the handwriting on Coleman's authorization note on the previous page. The silence was absolute. He's been signing his own delivery confirmations, Nathaniel said quietly. Not a question. Yes. Briggs signs the invoice. Coleman confirms the delivery, and nobody else is in a position to check whether the goods actually arrived. She closed the folder. This has been running for at least 3 years, possibly since you acquired the property. Nathaniel stood up. He walked to the window. He stood there with his back to her. And she let him have that moment because she understood this wasn't just money missing. This was 7 years of a man he'd trusted running a long, methodical theft under his nose, and that was the kind of thing you needed a moment to absorb. When he turned back, his face was composed. Not cold, there was something underneath it that was very close to fury, but controlled the way a deep river ran fast without showing whitecaps. What do we do? Vivian had been waiting for that question. We don't confront him yet, she said. Not until we have everything. If he suspects we're building a case, he'll destroy what he can and leave. And you'll spend the next year chasing him through lawyers. She looked at Nathaniel steadily. Let him think today scared me off. Let him think I'm a decorative wife who poked her nose in somewhere she shouldn't and got the message. She paused. Can you let him think that? I reckon I can manage it, Is. Slowly. 3 days. Give me 3 days and I'll have everything documented. He looked at her for a long time. The quality of that look had shifted from every other time he'd looked at her, not less serious, but more something. She didn't have a word for it yet. All right, he said. 3 days. She picked up the folder and went back to work. That was the night she understood something about Nathaniel Hawthorne that she hadn't fully grasped from the carriage ride or the conversations at Creeksides. He was not a man who stood aside because thought she couldn't handle something. He stood aside because he could see she was handling it, actually handling it. not gesturing in the direction of handling it, and he was smart enough and self-assured enough to recognize that his most useful role in that particular moment was to stay out of the way and let her work. She had never in her life met a man like that. She filed the observation and kept writing. 2 days passed. She was careful. She was pleasant at meals. She asked Coleman with apparent guileless curiosity about the history of the property, and listened to his answers with every indication of finding them fascinating, and noted every inconsistency between what he said and what the records showed. She spoke to Elias again, briefly and casually, in the middle of a larger group of workers so that no one could point to a private conversation. She talked to Tom Reardon about the horses and learned, in passing, that the feed costs in the books were running approximately 30% above what he actually received. She talked to Ruth, who had eyes and ears in every corner of that house, and who turned out, when given the opportunity, to have been paying very close attention for 7 years. "I knew something was wrong," Ruth told her on the second evening, sitting in the kitchen after the rest of the house had gone to bed. "I just didn't know what to do with the knowing. You did the right thing telling me about the seed delivery," Vivian said. "I didn't know it would matter." "Everything matters," Vivian said. "You just have to know how to put it together." Ruth looked at her with those old young eyes. "They said you were just some woman from Virginia that Mr. Hawthorne married for convenience." "I heard something similar. Coleman said it this morning. Said you'd be bored and want to go back east inside of a month." Vivian picked up her pen. "What did you?" Smiled slowly. "I didn't say anything. I just watched him." "Good," Vivian said. On the morning of the third day, Coleman made his move. He came to the main house at breakfast time, which was deliberate, a public setting, witnesses, a forum where scenes were difficult to create. He had Briggs with him, which was also deliberate. Briggs was carrying a ledger of his own, which told Vivian everything she needed to know about how they'd spent the last 2 nights. They'd been building a counter-narrative. Nathaniel was at the table. Vivian was beside him, coffee in hand, and she had known from the particular quality of the morning, from Ruth's careful look when she'd served breakfast, that today was the day. She'd been ready since before dawn. Coleman sat without being asked, which was the first move, establishing that this was his space, his territory, that her presence hadn't changed the fundamental power arrangement. "Hawthorne," he said, "I think we need to clear some air." Nathaniel set down his fork. "Then clear it. Your wife has been asking questions around the property." Coleman's voice was measured, reasonable, the voice of a man making a complaint about the weather. "Good questions. Some of them she's clearly interested in the operation. But some of the workers are getting unsettled, feeling like they're under suspicion. I think it's causing problems." "What kind of problems?" Nathaniel said. "Morale problems. Focus problems." Spread his hands. "I've run a tight operation here for 7 years. I think it's reasonable to ask that changes, if there are going to be changes, go through proper channels." Nathaniel looked at Vivian. She hadn't moved or changed expression. She looked at Coleman pleasantly. "Mrs. Hawthorne," Nathaniel said. "Anything you'd like to say?" "Yes." "Actually," she said. She set down her coffee. "Mr. Coleman, I appreciate you bringing your concerns directly. I want to do the same." She opened the folder that had been sitting in her lap under the table and placed it in front of Nathaniel. "I've spent the last 3 days reviewing the estate accounts in full. I'd like to walk through what I found." Coleman looked at the folder. Something behind his eyes shifted. She saw it, a quick calculation before his face settled back into careful neutrality. "Mrs. Hawthorne, those accounts represent years of complex operations, and I don't think a few days is enough." "The Whitmore Seed Company," Vivian said. "Louisville Post Office box registered to a Harold T. Coleman, your brother, I believe." The room went absolutely still. Briggs had gone white. Coleman's face didn't change. She had to give him credit. It took something real to hold a face like that when the ground was dropping underneath you. "I'm not sure what you're implying," he said. I'm not implying anything, Vivian said. I'm stating 22% markup over market rate on seed contracts, paid to a company owned by your family over 3 years. 800 board feet of timber paid for and not delivered. Fencing materials invoiced and confirmed by the same hand. She looked at him steadily. I have the original documents. I have the delivery records. I have signed statements from 2 employees who were instructed to confirm deliveries that did not occur. She paused. I'm not implying, Mr. Coleman. I'm telling you what I found. Coleman stood. He was a large man, and standing up was itself a statement, a reminder of physical presence. Of how long he'd stood in rooms like this one while other people sat. I've given 7 years to this property, he said. And his voice had changed now, the reasonableness gone. Something harder underneath. 7 years. Before Hawthorne bought this place. It was failing. I built what's here. And you come in after 4 days and wave papers at me like,
Sit down.
Coleman, Nathaniel's voice was quiet, completely quiet. But something in it worked the way a gate worked when it closed. It closed, and you didn't push against it without knowing what you were pushing. Coleman sat. Nathaniel looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at the folder. He'd read every page of it the night before. Vivian had made sure of that, but he looked at it again now. And the looking was its own statement. I trusted you, Nathaniel said. Not angry, not betrayed sounding, just factual, the way he said everything. Which somehow made it worse. 7 years I trusted you with this place. Hawthorne, I'm going to ask you to leave the property today, Nathaniel said. With what you came with, nothing more. I'll be contacting my solicitor in Louisville. Whether this goes any further is going to depend on how that conversation goes. And how willing you are to make it simple, he paused. But you're leaving today. Coleman's jaw tightened. He looked at Vivian with an expression she recognized, not hatred. Exactly, but its close relative, the particular fury of a man who has been stopped by someone he'd already dismissed. You've been here 4 days, he said to her. 3, she corrected pleasantly. He stood again. He looked at Briggs, who had not said a single word through any of this, who appeared to have quietly decided that his best option was to be functionally invisible, and then he walked out. Briggs followed. The door closed behind them. The kitchen was very quiet. Ruth, who had been absolutely motionless in the corner throughout the entire exchange, let out a breath. It was the loudest sound in the room. Nathaniel looked at Vivian. She looked back at him. 3 days, he said, I told you. He was quiet for a moment. You're not satisfied, he said, and it wasn't a question. He was reading her face, which she was learning he did carefully and accurately. You're still thinking. There's more to clean up, she said. Briggs needs to be dealt with carefully. He was following orders. Mostly, but he still signed documents he knew were fraudulent. And if you're too lenient, he'll interpret it as license. And the vendor contracts need to be renegotiated with companies that are actually at market rate. And the 2 supervisors who've been turning a blind eye in exchange for easier workloads. She stopped. I'm sorry. This is your property. You should tell me how much of this you want me involved in. Nathaniel looked at her for a long time. Vivian, he said, this is your property too. She didn't have anything to say to that, which was unusual. She almost always had something to say. I mean it, he said. Not because we're married, because you earned it in 3 days, and I'd like you to know that I know that. She looked down at the folder on the table, at the columns of figures she'd been carrying around for 3 days, that she'd constructed in lamplight while the house slept, that she'd assembled from fragments and ledger pages and a kitchen girl's careful observations. All right, she said quietly. All right, he said. And for a moment in that still Kentucky morning, with the sound of Coleman's boots fading across the yard outside, Vivian Caldwell Hawthorne felt something she hadn't felt in so long she'd nearly forgotten it had a name. She felt like herself, entirely without apology, without adjustment, without making herself smaller so that the people around her would feel comfortable with her size. Just herself. The feeling was so large and so unexpected that she didn't know what to do with it. So she did what she always did. She picked up her pen. She turned to the next page. She started on Briggs. Outside, the Kentucky morning opened wide and clear. And somewhere across the yard, Coleman was loading his things. And Harrow Hill was already beginning to breathe differently. And Vivian was already thinking about the drainage ditch. Briggs lasted exactly 4 days after Coleman left before he came to find Vivian himself. She was in the east field with Elias and 2 of the younger hands. Walking the drainage line she'd been thinking about since the first morning, when she heard footsteps behind her moving faster than a man with a clear conscience generally moved. She didn't turn around immediately. She finished what she was saying to Elias about the grade of the soil, about where the redirect needed to start, and then she turned. Briggs looked like a man who hadn't slept in 4 days. Which was likely accurate. He was thin in the face in a way he probably hadn't been a week ago. And his hands weren't entirely steady, and he was carrying his hat in both hands and working the brim in a way that was going to ruin it. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he said, "I need to speak with you." Elias glanced at her. She gave him the smallest nod, and he turned away and found something to say to the younger hands, moving them a few yards off with the naturalness of a man who understood discretion. "Go ahead, Mr. Briggs," she said. He swallowed. "I want you to know what I did. I did because Coleman told me to. I want you to know that. He's been here since before I was, and when a man like that tells you to sign something, you sign it, because the alternative is losing your position. And I've got a wife and 3 children," and he stopped himself. His jaw tightened. "I'm not asking for sympathy. I just want you to understand what it was." Vivian looked at him. She looked at the hat being destroyed between his hands. She looked at the shadows under his eyes and the tight, controlled misery of a man who had done something he knew was wrong, and had lived with the knowing for longer than was comfortable, and was now standing in front of the one person who had all the evidence and waiting to find out what happened next. She understood the position. She didn't excuse it. But she understood it. "What are you asking for, mister?" "A chance," he said, "to fix what I can fix. To be straight with you about what I know, all of it. Whatever you need, documents, name, the arrangement with Whitmore's seed, how the timber thing worked. I'll tell you everything." He met her eyes for the first time. "In exchange for keeping my position, under your oversight. Whatever conditions you set." Vivian was quiet for a moment. She thought about what Nathaniel had said, that she should tell him how much she wanted to be involved. She thought about the 2 supervisors who'd turned blind eyes for easier workloads. She thought about the shape of what Harrow Hill needed. Not just to be cleaned out, but to be rebuilt into something that didn't invite this kind of rot back in. She needed people who knew where the bodies were buried. Metaphorically speaking. "Here's what's going to happen," she said. "You're going to write down everything you just offered to tell me. Dates, names, amounts, method. Every piece of it in your own hand. Signed, you're going to give that to me by tomorrow morning." She held his gaze. "And then you're going to report directly to me, not to any supervisor. Directly to me. And if I ever find that you've been less than completely honest about anything the document goes to the county sheriff. Do you understand?" Briggs nodded. He looked like a man who'd been holding his breath for 4 days and had just been allowed to exhale. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Then get started," she said. "You've got until morning." He went. She turned back to the drainage line and the waiting men and the work, and she didn't let herself think about the Briggs situation any further, because thinking about it further wasn't useful right now. The drainage was useful. The drainage was the next thing. She had learned, somewhere in the last 20 years of keeping her family afloat without credit, that the way you got through large problems was to make them into a series of small problems and solve them in sequence. One at a time. Next thing, next thing, next thing. The only dangerous moment was when you looked at all of them at once. She kept looking at the drainage, what she didn't see. because she was looking at the drainage, was the rider that came through the main gate that afternoon. She heard about him from Ruth at supper. Ruth had a gift for moving through a house without being noticed, which meant she noticed everything. Man came from Louisville, Ruth said, setting down a dish with the careful casualness of someone delivering significant information. Lawyer type. He and Mr. Hawthorne were in the study for 2 hours. Vivian looked up. Mr. Hawthorne came out looking. Ruth paused, choosing her word. Steady. But the kind of steady that takes work. Vivian set down her fork and went to find Nathaniel. He was in the stable yard, which was where he went when he needed to think. She'd already learned that about him, that he thought better when his hands were doing something, and that the horses were where his hands went when his head was full. She didn't announce herself. She just walked out and stood near him. And after a moment he said, "Without turning, the solicitor's been talking to Coleman, I assumed. Coleman is contesting the accounts." He was brushing down the gray mare with long, even strokes, his back still to her. He's claiming the Whitmore contracts were legitimate agreements made with Hawthorne Hill's prior owner and carried over, and that I authorized the continuation. Did you know? The word came out flat and hard. I signed nothing related to Whitmore. I'd never heard of Whitmore until your document. Do you have records confirming that? He was quiet for a moment. Some, not all. Some of the early ownership transition documents were disorganized. The previous owner wasn't meticulous. Vivian stood very still and thought. This was the move she should have anticipated. Coleman had 7 years and existing relationships, and the accumulated advantage of being the one who was there first. Of course he'd prepared something. Of course he'd spent the 4 days since he left building a defense, looking for the gaps in the transition records, finding the places where Nathaniel's documentation was thin. "What does your solicitor advise?" she asked. "He says it'll be a long dispute. Expensive. He's not certain of the outcome." Nathaniel finally turned. He looked tired in a way she hadn't seen on him before. Not defeated. Nothing like defeated, but the particular tiredness of a man who has built something carefully for years and is now standing in front of damage he didn't cause and didn't see coming. He also says Coleman is known in Louisville, has a reputation as a competent manager. Men who've worked with him have spoken well of him. He paused. "Vivian, I need to know how solid is what you found." She looked at him directly. "Solid enough that I signed my name to it," she said. "Every figure, every discrepancy, every cross-reference. I don't sign my name to things I can't defend." "I know that," he said. "I'm not doubting you. I'm asking what we're walking into." "We're walking into a fight," she said. "He knew these records better than you did, and he's had more time to prepare his version. Which means we need something he can't prepare a version of." She was already thinking. The way she thought, fast and lateral, following the shape of a problem until it revealed its own weakness. The employees, the ones who signed false delivery confirmations. "Briggs is writing everything down tonight. But I need Jimmy Watts and whoever else Coleman pressured to put their names on paper too. They'll be frightened. Yes. But they'll be more frightened of what happens if Coleman wins and comes back." She met his eyes. "Will you let me handle it?" He looked at her for a long moment. The tiredness was still there, but something else was moving under it. Something that was coming to look familiar to her. That quality of attention that meant he was deciding something. Not about the problem, but about her. "Yes," he said. "Handle it." She went back inside. She sat at the desk and she thought about fear, and about what made frightened people brave, and about the specific calculus that changed the answer to that question. She thought about Jimmy Watts, who'd been told to sign for a delivery that never came and had done it, because Coleman was the authority here, and authority felt permanent when you were inside it. She thought about herself, 11 years old, watching her father dismiss something she'd said at dinner and deciding, in that moment, that she'd learned to say it differently. Better. So well that he couldn't dismiss it. She'd been having that thought, in one form or another, for 15 years. She understood Jimmy Watts completely. She found him the next morning before the workday started. She didn't call him to the house. That would have felt official. Threatening. She went to where he was, which was near the second barn. And she went alone, and she started talking to him about the eastern drainage, because that was something he knew about, and something that was genuinely going to affect his work. And she let him relax into the conversation before she said anything else. "Jimmy," she said, after they'd talked for 10 minutes about soil composition, "I want to ask you about the Whitmore delivery. The one you signed for." He went still. "I'm not here to get you in trouble," she said. "I'm here because I need to understand what happened. And you're the only person who knows it directly." She paused. "Coleman's in Louisville right now telling a lawyer that everything he did was authorized and legitimate. If that story holds, he could come back. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Jimmy's jaw worked. He was looking at the ground. "He told me to sign," he said. "Finally. Said the delivery would come in the next week, and it was just paperwork timing." He looked up. "It didn't come. Did anything come?" "About a quarter of what was on the invoice." "Maybe less. Would you be willing to write that down?" she said. "What you just told me. In your own words, signed. I have a solicitor who can make sure it's handled right. And I can make sure Coleman never holds a position that affects your livelihood again." She held his eyes. "But I need it in writing." He was quiet for a long time. "My family's been on this property 12 years, he said. "I know. It won't go wrong," she said. And she said it the way she said things she meant, without decoration, without performance, just the weight of a true thing. "I don't take on fights I can't win, Jimmy. I'm standing here because I know how this ends." He looked at her. Then he nodded. "All right," he said. "All right, I'll write it down." By the end of that day, she had 4 signed statements. By the end of the following day, she had 7. She sent them to Louisville with Nathaniel's solicitor on a Thursday morning, with a cover letter she'd written herself that laid out the documented fraud in 18 precise paragraphs and concluded with a single sentence. "I am prepared to present this evidence in any forum, Mr. Coleman wishes to contest it." She handed the package to the writer herself. She went back inside and ate breakfast. She did not feel triumphant. She felt the way she always felt when a large piece of work was complete, a practical satisfaction. The quiet that comes after something difficult is done right. She'd learned not to mistake that for happiness. Happiness was a different thing. And it required different conditions. What she didn't expect was the letter that arrived 3 days later. It didn't come from Coleman's lawyer. It came from Virginia, in her mother's handwriting, and it sat on the silver tray in the front hall for 2 hours before Vivian picked it up. Because she'd seen it when she came down that morning and had walked past it deliberately. Twice, before she admitted to herself that she was going to have to open it eventually. She opened it at the desk in the study alone. Her mother wrote the way she'd always done everything, with careful precision and a complete absence of anything that might be mistaken for vulnerability. The family had encountered some difficulties. The wedding had been followed by certain social consequences that had been more significant than anticipated. Rosalie, was her mother's phrase, was having a difficult time, which Vivian translated with practiced accuracy into something more specific and more painful. And there was a financial matter that required, if Vivian was willing, some consideration. The letter was 3 pages long. The word sorry did not appear. Vivian read it twice. Then she set it face down on the desk and sat with her hands flat on the wood and looked at the wall. She had spent 26 years in that family. She had kept their accounts, managed their creditors, written their correspondence. She had done it because she was good at it, and because someone had to, and because there was a part of her that had believed, long past the point of being reasonable, that competence would eventually translate into recognition. It had not. The letter in front of her was asking for money. Not asking, requesting, in the tone of a woman who expected the request to be honored because it was being made. Vivian sat there for a long time. She was still sitting there when Nathaniel found her. He came into the study, registered the set of her back and the letter face down on the desk. and sat in the opposite chair without saying anything. She appreciated that. She appreciated that he had learned. Already, the difference between silence that was waiting and silence that was being given. After a while, she said, "My family is in financial difficulty. I see, my mother is asking for assistance." He was quiet. "She doesn't say she's sorry," Vivian said, not once in 3 pages. She heard something in her own voice that she hadn't intended to let out, not quite grief. Not quite anger, but the thing that lived in the space between them. "I don't think she knows she has anything to be sorry for. I think she genuinely believes the situation was managed reasonably, and that the outcomes were simply unfortunate." "What do you want to do?" he asked. She looked at the window. "I don't know yet," she said. Which was the truest answer she had. "You don't have to decide today, I know. And whatever you decide," he said, "I'll support it, including if you decide to help them." She looked at him. He met her look evenly, the way he met everything. "They're your family," he said. "What they did was wrong. What you do about it is yours to choose. You're not going to tell me what you think I should do? No." "Ma'am." The corner of his mouth moved. "I reckon I know better than to stand between you and your own conclusions." Something loosened in Vivian's chest. "Not much. I'm going to need a few days," she said. "Take them." She picked up the letter. She read it a 3rd time. Slower, looking for what was underneath the careful words, looking for the mother she'd spent 26 years trying to reach through the performance of competence. Trying to find the woman who might have said even once, "I see you, I know what you do, it matters." She didn't find her. The letter was 3 pages of obligation dressed as affection. And underneath the obligation, there was nothing but more obligation. She set it down. She thought about Rosalie in the pew with the unguarded face. Having a difficult time, she thought about what that meant for a girl who had built her entire identity on being the one everyone looked at. She picked up her pen. She wrote back. It took her an hour. When she finished, she had said 3 things. That she was aware of the situation. That she would not be providing financial support at this time. And that Rosalie was welcome to write to her directly if she wished. She sealed the letter. She gave it to Ruth to send with the afternoon post. She felt afterward neither relieved nor guilty. She felt something quieter than either of those, a kind of bedrock-level steadiness that she recognized as a thing she had not possessed 3 weeks ago. Standing in a church corridor listening to bells, she had changed something. Not just in the house, not just in the accounts, in herself. That evening, Nathaniel came to find her again in the study, where she'd been working through the vendor renegotiations with the focus she normally gave to things she found genuinely interesting. He leaned in the doorway and looked at the papers spread across the desk and the ink on her fingers, and the way she had of going completely still when she was thinking something through. "The solicitor sent word," he said. "Coleman is withdrawing the contest." She looked up. The 7 statements were definitive, he said. His lawyer advised him that the documentation was sufficient for criminal prosecution, and that contesting further would accelerate that outcome rather than prevent it. She held his gaze. "And he's agreed to full restitution. Exact amount to be determined by audit. But the solicitor estimates somewhere between $4,000 and $6,000 over 3 years. He paused. "The audit will need to be conducted by someone with a detailed understanding of the accounts." "I'll do the audit," she said. "I know," he said. "I already told him that." She looked at him across the desk, across the papers, across 3 weeks of Kentucky mornings and drainage ditches and lamplight and 7 statements and a letter from Virginia. "Nathaniel," she said. Were you frightened?" she asked. "When the solicitor came and said Coleman was contesting. Were you frightened this wasn't going to work?" He was quiet for a moment. Genuinely quiet, the kind that meant he was actually considering the question rather than reaching for the first available answer. "I was worried," he said. "There's a distinction. Frightened is when you don't trust the outcome. Worried is when you trust it, but know it's going to cost something to get there." He looked at her. "I trusted the outcome. You trusted me," she said. Yes, he said simply. She looked back at her papers. She didn't know what to do with straightforward things. She'd had so little practice with them. Thank you, she said, and meant it in more directions than she could easily name. He nodded. He was about to leave. She could read the shift in how he was standing, and then he stopped. Vivian, he said. She looked up. I wrote to you for 8 months, he said. Before any of this. Before the church, before Coleman. Before any of it. I wrote to you because whoever was writing those letters was someone I wanted to know. I want you to understand that. He paused. I didn't choose you because you were available. I chose you because I'd already decided before I ever saw your face that you were the person I wanted standing next to me. The study was very quiet. Vivian looked at the man in the doorway, the broad shoulders and the work-worn hands and the gray eyes that looked at things fully, that didn't slide away from what they found there, that had looked at her in a church full of people who'd already decided she didn't matter and had seen someone worth crossing the room for. She thought about 10 minutes and getting practical. She thought about a bouquet in the mud. She thought, this is what changes. You should know, she said carefully, that I'm not good at receiving things. Kindness. Recognition. She held his gaze. I've spent so long earning what I needed that I don't always know what to do when it's simply given. I know, he said. I've noticed. I'm telling you so that you understand that when she stopped. Started again. When I don't know what to say, it doesn't mean it doesn't reach me. He looked at her for a long moment. It reaches you, he said. Yes, she said, it does. He nodded once. That economy of gesture she was coming to understand was its own language. Whole sentences compressed into a single movement. Then he said, the east drainage. I looked at the grade this afternoon like you showed me. She blinked. And I reckon you're right about the redirect point. I also reckon it's going to take most of the fall to do it properly. She felt the conversation shift, and she was grateful for the shift, because she'd had about as much of herself as she could manage in one evening. If we start before the ground hardens, we can get the primary channel done before winter and finish the secondary in spring. That's what I figured, he said. I'll get Tom and Elias started on clearing the line tomorrow. He pushed off the doorframe. Get some sleep, Vivian, in a while, she said. He almost smiled, then he went. She sat at the desk in the lamplight and looked at the audit paperwork she needed to begin and thought about $4,000 to $6,000 in restitution and a drainage ditch that was going to take all fall and a girl in a kitchen who had been watching for 7 years and waiting for something interesting to happen. She thought about a man who had written her letters for 8 months before he knew what she looked like. She thought about herself. The version of herself that had stood in a church corridor 3 weeks ago with $32 in a tin box and no next step. That woman felt very far away. She picked up her pen. She started on the audit. Outside, Harrow Hill was quiet in the way that places got quiet when the wrong thing had been removed from them, not empty, but clarified, like a room after you've opened all the windows. The kind of quiet that was actually the sound of something beginning. The audit took 6 weeks. Vivian worked through it the way she worked through everything, methodically. Completely, without announcing what she was doing until she was certain what she'd found. By the 3rd week, she had stopped thinking of it as an audit and started thinking of it as archaeology. Because what she was uncovering wasn't just Coleman's theft. It was the entire history of Harrow Hill's mismanagement. Layer by layer, going back further than Coleman, back to the previous owner. Back to decisions made by men who had treated good land like a resource to be extracted rather than something to be tended. The restitution figure came in at $5,340. She presented it to Nathaniel on a Tuesday morning, with a 14-page summary and a separate sheet that showed, in 2 columns, what Harrow Hill had actually produced over the last 3 years versus what it should have produced under proper management. The gap between those 2 columns was the real cost of Coleman, not just what he'd taken, but what he'd prevented. Nathaniel read the summary. Then he read it again. Then he set it on the desk and looked at the wall for a moment. The potential column, he said. Yes. Is that realistic? Without the theft, without the inflated contracts. With proper management that's actually achievable. In 3 to 5 years. Yes, she paused. Possibly faster if the eastern drainage performs the way I expect it to. He looked at her. The drainage you designed. The drainage we're building, she said. Elias and Tom are doing the actual work. But you designed it. I drew some lines on paper. Nathaniel, you saved this property, he said, and the directness of it. The complete absence of qualification landed the way direct things always landed with her. She didn't know what to do with it. So she looked back at the documents. The property saved itself, she said. It was always capable. It just needed someone to look at it properly. She heard him exhale, not a sigh. Something shorter, the sound a man made when he was letting a disagreement go, because he'd recognized it wasn't actually an argument. She was starting to know his sounds. The solicitor confirmed receipt of the first installment from Coleman, he said. $2,000. The remainder over 6 months. Good. She gathered the pages. I'd like to use the restitution to capitalize the spring planting properly. Full market rate seed contracts, 3 new vendor agreements I've already identified. And a salary adjustment for Elias. He's been doing management level work for laborers' pay for at least 2 years, and it needs to be corrected before someone else recognizes it and recruits him away. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. You already negotiated the vendor agreements? Provisionally. Subject to your approval. Of course, he said, and there was something in his voice, warmth. She was learning to call it what it was that she felt in her chest before she could stop it. Of course I approved them. That was the morning that Harrow Hill turned a corner so definitive that everyone on the property felt it. Even the people who couldn't have articulated what had changed. The rhythm of the place shifted. Work that had been done slowly because there was no particular incentive to do it, quickly started moving at a different pace. Elias, with his adjusted salary and his direct reporting line to Vivian, became the kind of foreman who made other men want to work harder. Ruth, who had always been the kitchen girl, started managing the household provisions with an efficiency that cut their costs by a fifth, and did it so quietly that it was 3 weeks before anyone noticed. Vivian noticed, she told Ruth directly, which made the girl stand very still for a moment before she said, "No one's ever said that to me before," and then turned back to the stove with a ferocity that suggested she didn't know what to do with recognition either. Vivian understood. It was the 6th week of the audit. On a Thursday afternoon when the first real cold of autumn was starting to find the edges of things, that the Caldwell family arrived at Harrow Hill. Vivian found out the way she found out most things from Ruth, who appeared in the doorway of the study with an expression that was doing a great deal of careful work to remain neutral. "There's a carriage at the gate," she said. "Virginia plates." Vivian set down her pen. She sat for exactly the span of 3 long breaths. Then she stood, straightened her jacket, and went to find Nathaniel. He was already coming to find her. They met in the hall. And he looked at her face and said, "Ruth told me." "How many?" She counted 3 inside the carriage. "Your mother, your sister, a man she didn't recognize." Vivian thought about the letter she'd sent back. The one that had said, "Not at this time," and Rosalie was welcome to write directly. 3 months had passed since that letter. No direct letter from Rosalie had come. Instead, they had come themselves. "All right," she said. "Do you want me with you?" She looked at him. She thought about the churchyard and her father's hand on her arm and the word wife landing like something factual and right. She thought about the fact that she had handled Coleman's fraud and 7 witness statements and a 14-page audit, and she did not, strictly speaking, need anyone to handle her family. She also thought about not being alone in a room with her mother for the first time in 3 months with no one else present. "Yes," she said. "Please." He nodded once. They went to the front of the house together. Her mother came through the door first, which was always how it had been, her mother entering spaces ahead of other people, establishing herself before the room had time to prepare. She was thinner than Vivian remembered, And she was wearing her second-best traveling clothes, which meant the best ones were either sold or in storage. And both of those possibilities told Vivian something specific about the last 3 months in Virginia. Vivian, her mother said, her eyes went to Nathaniel, assessed him in the practiced way she assessed everything, and then returned to her daughter. "You look well, Mother," Vivian said. "This is unexpected. Letters take so long." Her mother moved into the hall with the assurance of a woman who had never in her life waited to be invited into a room. "I thought it was better to come directly, to speak in person." Rosalie came through the door behind her. Vivian had been preparing herself for this moment for approximately 6 weeks, ever since the letter, and she still wasn't entirely prepared. Because the girl who came through the door was not the Rosalie she remembered. Not the silver laugh and the deliberate entrance and the performance of being looked at. This Rosalie was 22 years old, and she was wearing a dress that had been carefully mended, and her hands were not entirely steady, and her face, when it found Vivian's, held an expression that Vivian had only seen once before in the front pew of a Virginia church. For approximately 4 seconds before composure returned. The composure hadn't returned this time, "Vivian," she said. And her voice was smaller than Vivian had ever heard it. "Rosalie," Vivian said. The third person through the door was a man Vivian didn't recognize, 40. Perhaps, with the careful manner of someone present in a professional capacity. He introduced himself as Mr. Arthur Finch, and he was, he explained, assisting the Caldwell family with some financial matters. A lawyer, then. They'd brought their own lawyer. Vivian looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel looked back at her, expression that meant he was reading the situation and was going to let her lead it. "Come through to the parlor," she said. They sat. Ruth appeared with tea that nobody had asked for, which Vivian appreciated, both for the tea and for Ruth's instinct that this was the kind of meeting that needed the brief interruption of something ordinary. Her mother didn't touch her cup. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her spine straight and said, "The estate is in some difficulty, I know," Vivian said. "You wrote. The situation has developed further since then." Her mother paused, a controlled pause. A pause that was doing a great deal of management work. "Your father had debts that we were not aware of. Creditors have been persistent." "How much?" How? Mother, another pause. $11,000. The parlor was quiet. Vivian looked at her mother and at her sister and at the lawyer with his hat on his knee, and she thought about her father, the man who had stood at a window and told her she wasn't what men like Nathaniel Hawthorne were looking for, who had sent her work to another man under his own name for 4 years, who had replaced her at her own wedding with 3 days' notice and delivered the news without watching her face. $11,000. "That's a considerable sum," Nathaniel said. From beside her, his voice was neutral, not cold. Just factual. "Yes," Mr. Finch said. "The Caldwell property could be sold to cover approximately 60% of the outstanding amount. There remains a significant, I understand, arithmetic." "Mr. Finch," Vivian said. He stopped. She looked at her mother. She looked at her directly, the way she'd rarely let herself look at this woman fully, without the filter of hoping to find something that wasn't there. "What are you asking for, Mother?" Her mother's composure held. It had always held. Vivian had never once in her memory seen her mother's composure actually break, and she didn't know whether to admire it or grieve it. "We are asking whether you might be in a position to assist the family." "In some capacity," Vivian repeated. "A loan, perhaps, against the eventual sale of the Virginia property." Her mother's eyes moved briefly to Nathaniel and back. "Or simply some arrangement." Vivian sat with it for a moment. She thought about $11,000 and 60%, and Mr. Finch's careful language, and her mother's straight spine, and all the things that were not being said in this room. Then she said, "Where is Father?" The silence that followed was a different kind of silence. Her mother's hands, still folded in her lap, pressed together slightly harder. "Your father is unwell," she said. "How unwell?" "He had an episode." In July. The physician says he needs quiet and limited excitement. She paused. He is at home. Vivian looked at Rosalie, who had not said a word since her name had been spoken in the hallway. Rosalie, her sister looked up. Is he going to recover? Rosalie's jaw tightened. She looked for a moment, very young and very tired. The doctor doesn't know, she said. And then quietly, he asks about you sometimes when he's having a good day. Vivian sat with that. She sat with it for long enough that the room got quiet in a way that required acknowledgement. I'll need to think, she said finally, about what I can and can't do. I'm not going to make a decision in this room today. And I'm not going to make a promise I haven't examined. Her mother's expression shifted, not quite surprise, but something adjacent to it. This was not the daughter she'd expected to find in Kentucky. She'd expected the Vivian who complied, who managed, who smoothed things over because the alternative was conflict, and conflict was always Vivian's problem to avoid. Of course, her mother said carefully. You're welcome to stay, Vivian said. There's room. Ruth will see to it, she stood. But I'd like you to understand something before we go further. She looked at her mother, then at Rosalie, then back. I am not the same person who stood in that corridor in June. I don't say that as a reproach. I say it so we're all beginning from an honest place. She paused. Whatever happens next, it's going to happen on honest terms. That's the only terms I have. Her mother said nothing. But something in her face behind the composure was recalculating. Rosalie looked at her sister across the parlor and said, very quietly, that's fair. It was the most honest thing Vivian had ever heard from her. That evening, after her mother had been settled into a guest room, and Mr. Finch had been given a bed in the East Wing, and the house had gone through the complicated motions of accommodating people it hadn't been expecting, Vivian found Rosalie in the kitchen. Ruth was nowhere in sight, which Vivian suspected was deliberate. The girl had instincts. Rosalie was sitting at the table with a cup of tea she wasn't drinking, and she looked up when Vivian came in, and neither of them said anything for a moment. They sat with the silence between them, the accumulated weight of 22 years of the same house, the same dinner table, the same parents looking at them and deciding every single day which one mattered more. I didn't know he was going to send me in your place, Rosalie said. Vivian looked at her. I want you to know that. I didn't know until the morning of. She pressed her hands flat on the table. I should have refused. I know that. I've known that every day since. She looked up. I didn't refuse because I was a coward, and because part of me, the worst part, she stopped. Swallowed. Part of me thought I deserved it more. The beautiful dress and the important man and all of it. Her voice had gone very thin. Vivian, think that anymore. What changed? She said. Rosalie looked at her with eyes that had seen something in the last 3 months that had rearranged them. Finding out that none of it was real, she said. The man father had lined up before yours. The business arrangement he'd been building it was all connected to the debts. He wasn't finding me a good match. He was using me the same way he used you. Just a different tool, she exhaled. I spent 22 years being the pretty one. And it turns out that was just another way of being managed. The kitchen was very quiet. I'm sorry, Rosalie said. I know that's not enough. I know it doesn't fix anything, but I am, she met Vivian's eyes. I'm sorry for every time I let them make you small. I should have said something. I was old enough to know better long before I actually knew better. Vivian looked at her sister, this girl she had grown up alongside, who had lived in the same house and breathed the same air and been shaped by the same forces in a completely different direction. She thought about what it would have cost Rosalie, at 16 or 18 or 20, to push back against the family structure that had made her its prize and its currency. She thought about cowardice and complicity and the difference between them, and about whether that difference mattered as much as what came after. She thought about what Nathaniel had said once, about building everything to prove something to a dead man. She didn't want to spend the next 20 years proving something to a family that wasn't even in the room. It helps, what you said. It doesn't fix it. But it helps. Rosalie nodded. She looked like she'd been carrying those words for 3 months and had just been allowed to set them down. What are you going to do? She asked. About Mother's request. I don't know yet, Vivian said. And then, because this was apparently the day for honesty, I don't feel responsible for Father's debts. I don't feel obligated to solve a problem that was made by people who had every option to include me and chose not to. She paused. But I also don't want to be the reason the family loses the house entirely. Not because of what they deserve, but because of what kind of person I want to be. Rosalie looked at her for a moment. You always did know who you wanted to be, she said softly. Even when they wouldn't let you be it. Vivian didn't answer that. There wasn't an answer that didn't hurt in several directions at once. She went to find Nathaniel. He was in the study, which she'd come to think of as their study, though she'd never said it out loud. He looked up when she came in and waited. Because he'd learned that she thought better when she talked it through, and that talking it through required someone who was going to listen rather than advise. $11,000, she said. Yes. I don't have $11,000. No. But I do. She stopped. He looked at her steadily. Harrow Hill, with the restitution and the spring projections, can absorb a loan of that size over 5 years without significant impact to operations. He paused. I'm not suggesting you owe it to them. I'm suggesting it's available if you want it. That's your money. It's our money, he said. The same simple correction, the same matter-of-fact quality. You produced a 14-page audit that recovered $5,000 and restructured this property's entire operational future. I think that earns you a say in how the capital is used. Vivian stood in the middle of the study and felt something very large and very complicated moving through her. She'd been in this marriage for 3 months. 3 months, and this man was sitting across a desk telling her that his money was her money, and that her work had earned her standing in decisions about it. And he was saying it like it was simply factual, like it was obvious. Like it had never occurred to him that it might be otherwise. She thought about $32 in a tin box. She thought about a bouquet in the mud. She thought, this is what it was supposed to feel like. A loan, she said. To not a gift. Written terms. Through a solicitor. Whatever terms you set. And I want Rosalie employed. He blinked slightly. Employed. She's capable, Vivian said. She's better with people than I am. Considerably better. She could manage the household account correspondence, the vendor relationships, the kind of social navigation that doesn't come as naturally to me. She paused. She needs to earn something for herself. She's been a commodity her whole life. She needs to know she can do real work. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. Then, you're asking me to bring your sister into this household in a working capacity? Yes. After she stood at your altar in your dress? Yes. He looked at her for a long time. You're a more generous person than you give yourself credit for. I'm a practical person, she said. Rosalie in a position of genuine responsibility is better for everyone than Rosalie adrift and being managed by the man decides she's useful. Those aren't mutually exclusive, he said. Generous and practical. She didn't have a response to that. So she looked at the papers on the desk. I'll speak to Mother tomorrow, she said. With Mr. Finch present. Written terms, clear conditions. I'll have our solicitor ride out in the morning. Thank you, she said. Then Nathaniel, he looked up. I want you to know. She stopped. She was not good at this. She'd said it before, and it was still true, and she was trying to be better. I want you to know that I see what you do. The way you make room. She met his eyes. I don't take it for granted. He was quiet for a moment. I know you don't, he said. The meeting with her mother the following morning was the hardest conversation of Vivian's life. And she'd had some difficult ones. She sat across from her mother and Mr. Finch at the parlor table, with Nathaniel beside her and the solicitor beside him, and she laid out the terms she'd spent the previous night constructing. A loan of $11,000, interest at 4%. repayment over 7 years through the proceeds of the Virginia property sale, and a structured arrangement of the remaining estate income. Written, witnessed, legally binding. Her mother listened to all of it without interrupting. When Vivian finished, the room was quiet. "You've thought about this carefully," her mother said. "I have." Her mother paused. "These are more generous terms than I expected. They're fair terms," Vivian said. "Fair to you and fair to us. I didn't make them generous to make a point, and I didn't make them harsh to make one either." She held her mother's gaze. "I made them fair because that's how I operate." Her mother looked at her daughter. Really looked. In a way that Vivian couldn't remember having been looked at in this woman's presence before, not assessed. Not evaluated for usefulness, but actually seen. Like the person sitting across the table was genuinely unexpected. "I owe you an apology," her mother said. The room was very still. For June, her mother continued, and her voice had changed. The careful management was still there. But underneath it something was coming through that was older and more ragged. "For before June, for a great many things that I allowed to happen in that house for a very long time," she paused. "I told myself it was practical, that it was what the situation required. I am aware that this is not the same as it being right." Vivian sat with it. She sat with the apology that had 3 months ago not existed and now existed. Imperfect and qualified and real. She thought about what she wanted from it. She thought about the version of herself that had stood in a corridor, wanting anyone to say, "I see what's been done to you." "Thank you," she said. "I hear you." Her mother nodded. She didn't push for more, which was, Vivian thought, the first time in memory that her mother had not pushed for more. They signed the papers that afternoon. Mr. Finch rode out the following morning. Satisfied, presumably, that he'd earned his fee. Her mother stayed 3 more days, which was enough time for something to shift between them, not repaired. Nothing as tidy as repaired, but something that had been broken in a very particular direction was now broken differently, in a way that might, with time and deliberate care, be worked with. Rosalie stayed. She appeared in the study on the morning of the 4th day, with her hands steady and her spine straight and a look on her face that Vivian recognized with a shock of something close to recognition, because it was the same look she saw in the mirror sometimes. The look of a woman who has decided to stop waiting to be given a place in a room and has started taking one. "Tell me what you need," Rosalie said. Vivian looked at her sister. She thought, there it is. "The vendor correspondence is 3 weeks behind," she said. "And the household accounts need reorganizing from scratch." She paused. "Can you start today?" "I can start right now," Rosalie said. Vivian handed her a ledger. Rosalie sat down at the other desk, the one that had been empty since Briggs had moved to his restructured role in the East Field office. And she opened the ledger and looked at it, and then looked up. "Vivian, I'm going to need you to show me how to do this properly." I was never taught." She paused. "No one ever thought to teach me." Vivian looked at her sister across the study. Through the autumn light, and the ledgers, and the 3 months, and the 22 years. "I know," she said. "Pull your chair outside." The drainage channel was nearly complete. Elias and Tom and 3 of the younger hands had been at it for 6 weeks. Cutting through Kentucky earth in the precise line that Vivian had drawn on paper back when she'd been at Harrow Hill for less than a day, and was still learning the names of the people she was working alongside. In the spring, the eastern fields were going to drain properly for the first time in years. In the spring, the crop yields were going to be different. In the spring, Harrow Hill was going to show the world what it had always been capable of, once someone stopped stealing from it and started building it instead. But that was spring. Right now there was a ledger open and a sister leaning close, and the particular quiet of 2 people doing real work together for the first time in their lives. And outside the window the autumn light was long and gold across the Kentucky land. And Vivian Caldwell Hawthorne sat in the middle of the life she had built and felt it fully. Without qualification, without waiting for it to be taken away. She felt it. The eastern drainage worked. Vivian didn't make an announcement about it. She didn't need to. The first week of March, when the snow melt came down off the hills, the way it always did, fast and heavy and indiscriminate, and the eastern fields held instead of flooding. Elias came to find her in the study with mud on his boots and an expression on his face that said everything before he opened his mouth. "It's holding," he said. "I know," she said. She'd been watching from the window since dawn. "The edge planting is dry, I know." He stood there for a moment. This man who had worked this land for 12 years and watched it fail in the same places every single spring. And he looked at her with something that wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite awe, but lived in the territory between them. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he said, "I've been on this property since before Mr. Hawthorne bought it. I've never seen that field drain in March. You will every year from now on," she said. He nodded once, touched the brim of his hat, and went back to work. Vivian turned from the window and picked up her pen. She had 3 vendor letters to finish, a crop projection to update with the new drainage data, and a meeting with the county land assessor that afternoon regarding the property boundary question that had been sitting unresolved since the previous fall. None of it was small work, and all of it was hers, and she moved through it with the focused efficiency of someone who had stopped waiting for permission to occupy the full width of her own capabilities. Rosalie knocked on the study door at 10 and came in with the household account ledger and a question about a feed invoice that didn't match the delivery record. She set the papers on Vivian's desk, pointed to the discrepancy, and waited. Vivian looked at it. "The delivery came in 2 shipments," she said. "Check the second entry, dated 3 days later." Rosalie looked. Found it, nodded. "I should have caught that." "You caught the discrepancy," Vivian said. "That's the part that matters." Rosalie gathered the papers. She moved differently than she had. When she'd arrived in October, there was still something graceful in the way she occupied a room. But the performance quality was gone, the silvery deliberateness of a woman who had been trained from childhood to be watched. What was left was just her. Vivian found she liked just her considerably more. "The Whitfield family sent another invitation," Rosalie said. At the door. "Spring gathering, they've sent 3 now, I know. People want to meet you," Rosalie said. "Officially. As Mrs. Hawthorne of Harrow Hill, not just as Nathaniel's wife who fixed the drainage." Vivian looked up. "Is that how they say it? Who fixed the drainage?" "The women say it with respect," Rosalie said carefully. "The men mostly say it with confusion." "That'll change," Vivian said. "It already is," Rosalie said. And then, with something that was almost the old smile, the light. Genuine version, the one that existed before it had been turned into a performance. "You should let people meet you, Vivian. You might actually like some of them." She left. Vivian looked at the invitation on the edge of the desk. She thought about the Virginia town where everyone had known her family's business and had opinions about her face and had let her stand in a corridor while her wedding happened without her. She thought about Kentucky, about how the distances out here were big enough to let a person be new. She picked up her pen and wrote back to the Whitfields. Yes, they would attend. Nathaniel found the response on the outgoing correspondence stack that afternoon and looked at it for a moment and then looked at her. "The Whitfields," he said. "Rosalie thinks we should let people meet us properly." "Rosalie is right," he said. "Then, you know what people are going to want to talk about." "The drainage," she said. "The drainin'. The audit. The way Harrow Hill has changed in 9 months," he paused. "You. Mostly." Vivian looked at him. "That doesn't worry you?" "Why would it worry me?" "Some men are bothered by Vivian." He said her name the way he always said it, directly. Without decoration, like it was simply the word for the person he was talking to. "I married you because of who you are. I'm not going to be bothered when other people notice who you are." She looked at him for a moment. She still didn't always know what to do with the directness. She expected every time that she'd get better at it. And every time it still landed somewhere unguarded. "All right," she said, "the Whitfields." She went back to work. The gathering was on a Saturday in late March, and Vivian wore a dress that Rosalie had quietly made for her, deep blue. Well cut, not showy, The kind of dress that said I am a woman who knows what she's doing without having to announce it. Rosalie had presented it 3 days before the event. Set it on the chair in Vivian's room without comment. And disappeared, which was exactly the right approach. Vivian wore it. She stood in the Whitfield parlor with Nathaniel beside her, and she met the county's established families one by one. And she talked about crop rotation with the older farmers, and about the lumber market with the merchants, and about drainage engineering with anyone who brought it up. Which was almost everyone. The women of the county were the most interesting. There were several of them 30s and 40s. Mostly with the practical intelligence of women who had been running households and making real decisions for years, and had learned to do it in the spaces their husbands thought they controlled. They found Vivian, or she found them. It happened organically, the way useful connections always did, and by the end of the evening she had 3 real conversations, and the beginning of something she hadn't had in a long time. Company, the kind that assumed she had something worth saying. A man named Robert Whitfield, the host, 50s, with the confident authority of someone who had been important in this county for long enough to have forgotten that it was local importance, cornered Nathaniel near the fireplace and said, loudly enough to carry, "Your wife is quite something." Hawthorne didn't expect the audit business, thought that was an exaggeration. It wasn't, Nathaniel said. Coleman was well regarded here, Whitfield said, with the tone of a man revisiting a prior judgment. I'll admit I had my doubts when I heard a woman had come in and sorted it out in 3 days. She sorted it in 3 days, Nathaniel said. The documentation took a little longer. Whitfield looked across the room at Vivian. Where'd you find her? Virginia, Nathaniel said. She found me, more accurately. Vivian, who had heard all of this while appearing to be entirely focused on the woman beside her, did not smile. She saved it for later, for the carriage ride home. When she let it out and Nathaniel saw it and said, "You heard that, every word." She found me, more accurately, he repeated. It's true, it's generous, it's accurate, he said. I went to Virginia looking for a practical marriage. You're the one who turned it into something worth having. The carriage was quiet for a moment. Nathaniel, she said, I need to tell you something. He waited. She paused. She had thought about how to say this for 3 weeks. Had constructed and rejected a dozen different versions. And had concluded that the only one that was going to work was the direct one. Because that was the language they both spoke. I'm happy, she said. I want you to know that. Not grateful, or not only grateful. Genuinely happy. In a way that I don't have a lot of previous experience with. Which is possibly why it took me so long to say it out loud. She looked at him. I wanted you to know. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment that was long enough to be meaningful. I know, he said finally. I've been watching you figure that out for about 2 months. She stared at him. You knew before I did. You're very good at most things, he said. Noticing your own happiness is a skill that takes some people longer to develop. She didn't know whether to be irritated or touched. She settled on both. You could have said something. I figured you'd get there, he said. You always do. The carriage moved through the Kentucky dark. And Vivian Hawthorne sat across from her husband and felt the truth of what she'd said, not as a revelation, but as a confirmation of something that had been building for 9 months. Accumulating in drainage ditches and audit pages and lamplit evenings, and a man who stepped between her and her father without making it a performance. Who read letters for 8 months and decided on the basis of how someone thought that she was worth crossing a state for. She had been happy before she had words for it. She was glad she had the words now. What she didn't know, sitting in that carriage, was that the following Monday was going to be the hardest day she'd had since her first week at Harrow Hill. And the hardest part wasn't going to come from outside. It was going to come from Virginia. The letter arrived Monday morning. It came with the regular post, sandwiched between a vendor invoice and a land registry notice. In her mother's handwriting on paper that was slightly less fine than her mother usually used. Vivian noted the quality of the paper, her mother's circumstances. 9 months after the financial restructuring, still evident in these small economies, and opened it. She read it once, standing at the hall table. Then she sat down on the hall bench and read it again. Her father had died 4 days ago quietly, in his own bed, with her mother and Rosalie present. The physician said it was his heart. The letter was 3 paragraphs. The third paragraph contained a single sentence that Vivian read 4 times before she was certain she'd understood it correctly. "He left you the Virginia study," the letter said. "The room and everything in it. He said you'd know why." She sat on the bench for a long time. She thought about a man standing at a window with his back to her, telling her she wasn't what men like Nathaniel Hawthorne were looking for. She thought about 4 years of her work going out under his name. She thought about a dress altered by mourning, and a corridor, and a bouquet thrown into the mud. She thought about a small girl sitting on the floor of a study teaching herself accounting from ledgers, because the numbers made sense when nothing else did. And a man who had sat at that desk above her and had never, not once, looked down and said, "That's remarkable that you can do that." She sat with the grief of it. The specific, complicated grief of losing someone you had needed more from than they ever gave. And knowing now with absolute finality that they never would. Rosalie appeared from the direction of the kitchen, took one look at her sister's face, and sat down beside her on the bench without saying anything. She took Vivian's hand. They sat there for a while. "He asked about you," Rosalie said finally, at the end. "When he was having good days. He asked what you'd done with the property. And Mother would tell him about the drainage and the audit, and he'd go quiet when she told him. For a long time." "Did he say anything?" Vivian asked. Rosalie was quiet. "He said she always did know how to fix things." Vivian looked at the wall. She thought it wasn't enough. She thought it was something. She thought, "I can hold both of those at once." She had learned, in 9 months, that the truth was almost always more than one thing simultaneously, and that the ability to hold contradictory true things without needing to resolve them into something simpler was not a weakness. It was the only honest way to live. "I have to tell Nathaniel," she said. "I'll get him," Rosalie said. He came. He sat beside her, and he didn't say the things people usually said, which was one of the things she had come to love about him. He didn't reach for the available consolations, the easy phrases that were really about the speaker's discomfort with someone else's grief. He sat with her, and he was present, and he waited for her to say what she needed to say. "He left me the study," she said. "Your father's study. The room where he told me I wasn't what men like you were looking for." She heard her own voice, steady and honest. "The room where I learned to read ledgers on the floor because nobody thought to teach me." She paused. I think it was the closest he could come to saying something he didn't have language for. "What do you want to do?" Nathaniel asked. She thought about it. "I want to go to Virginia, for the service, and to see the room. Then we'll go. You don't have to, Vivian." He looked at her. "We'll go." They went. The Virginia journey took 4 days. The same 4 days in reverse. And she sat in the carriage and watched the Kentucky land give way to the Virginia hills, and thought about direction, about how the same road meant completely different things depending on which way you were traveling on it. She had left Virginia 9 months ago with nothing. She was returning with, she didn't know how to enumerate it. Too large for a list. Her mother met them at the door. She was thinner. She was older, in a way that 9 months shouldn't have produced. But grief did what it did. She looked at Vivian and she looked at Nathaniel, and then she stepped aside and let them in. And Vivian thought, this is different. This is different from October. Her mother had always managed rooms. She'd always been the one who decided the temperature of a space, who positioned herself at its center and directed everything around her. She was not doing that now. She was standing in a house that was already being sold, in a life that had been restructured around terms her daughter had set. And she was looking at Vivian with something that was older and quieter than anything she'd ever turned in her direction before. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Of course," Vivian said. They stood in the hall for a moment. Then her mother said, "He kept your letters, you know, the ones from Kentucky." He had Ruth, the solicitor's secretary, read them to him. Toward the end, when his eyes were giving him trouble, she paused. "He was proud of you." He didn't know how to say it. But he was. Vivian looked at her mother. She thought about what she wanted to say and what was true and whether those were the same thing. Sometimes they were. Sometimes the true thing was too complicated to say all at once. "So you said the part of it you could reach." "I know," she said. It wasn't entirely true, but it was the part she could hold without breaking something she'd spent 9 months building. Her mother nodded. She turned toward the parlor. "There are people coming for the service tomorrow. Come rest first." The service was small. The financial difficulties had clarified the social relationships the people who attended were the ones who had meant it, which turned out to be fewer than expected and more genuine than the alternative. Vivian stood through it with Nathaniel on one side and Rosalie on the other, and she grieved in the particular way she'd always done everything quietly, fully without making it public. Afterward, she went to the study. She stood in the doorway for a moment. It was exactly as she remembered. The desk at the window, the shelves, the ledgers that had been her childhood companions. The smell of old paper, and the particular quality of a room where a man had spent most of his hours. She walked in. She sat in the chair behind the desk. The chair she had never, not once in her life, sat in. She sat in it and she looked at the room from this side of the desk. And she thought about a girl on the floor learning numbers because nobody had thought to teach her at the table. And she thought about what her father had understood at the end that he hadn't been able to say before. He'd left her the desk. She put her hands flat on the surface of it. The wood was worn where his hands had rested for 30 years. She sat there for a long time. Then she stood up. She went back to Nathaniel, who was waiting in the hall, and she said, "I know what I want to do with it." He waited. The desk and the books, they come back to Kentucky. But the room itself, she paused. There are women in this county who were never taught what I had to teach myself on that floor. Women whose families didn't think to educate them because it wasn't considered useful. She looked at him. "I want to establish a school, not a charity, a real school, with proper instruction in accounting and land management and correspondence and law. Things that women need to know to manage their own affairs." She held his eyes. "I want to do it here, in this building, because it's what this room should have been used for all along." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. "How much do you need to start it?" he asked. She already knew. She'd been doing the figures in her head for 2 days. $800 for the first year. Self-sustaining after that if enrollment reaches 12 students. "Done," he said. Just like that, he said. "It's a good use of capital, and you know it's a good use of capital. You wouldn't have proposed it otherwise." He paused. "And it's right, you know it's right." She did know. She also knew that she was standing in the hallway of her father's house, in the county where she'd been the plain one, and the overlooked one, and the one who couldn't be what men like Nathaniel Hawthorne were looking for. And she was proposing to build something here, something that would outlast the gossip and the old social hierarchies and the long memory of a small Virginia town, and the man beside her was saying yes without qualification. She thought, this is what it means to have a partner. Not someone who rescues you, someone who stands beside you while you build. They stayed 4 days, long enough for Vivian to meet with a local solicitor about establishing the school, to draft the founding documents, to identify a woman, a Mrs. Clara Pratt, a widow of 40 with sharp eyes and a background in letters who could serve as the school's first instructor. Clara Pratt looked at Vivian across her parlor table with the assessing intelligence of a woman who had learned to decide about people quickly and accurately. "Why me?" she asked. "Because you've been teaching the alderman girls informally for 3 years and charging them nothing because their father won't pay for a woman's education," Vivian said. "I found that out in approximately 1 afternoon of conversation in this county. You're already doing the work. I'm offering to let you do it properly. Clara stared at her. You found that out in an afternoon. I pay attention, Vivian said simply. Clara looked at her for another moment. Then she said, When do we start? As soon as the documents are filed, Vivian said. I'd like the school open by fall, Clara nodded once. Then it'll be open by fall, the night before they left Virginia. Vivian went back to the study alone. She stood in the dark for a moment, just standing, letting the room be what it was, her past. Her starting point, the place where she had first understood that she was capable of more than anyone around her was going to acknowledge. She thought about the girl who had sat on this floor and taught herself and waited and waited some more, and had eventually stopped waiting and started building instead. She thought about drainage ditches and audit columns and a carriage ride through the Blue Ridge and a man who had read 8 months of her letters and decided, from the quality of how she thought, that she was the one worth crossing a state for. She thought about Rosalie, sitting at the other desk now, learning ledgers the way Vivian had learned them, not alone on a floor, but at a table with someone to show her. She thought about Ruth, managing a household at 16 with the instincts of someone 3 times her age, deserving every piece of recognition she was finally being given. She thought about Clara Pratt, who was going to open a school in the fall, in this room, and teach the daughters of Virginia the things that nobody had thought to teach them before. She put her hand on the doorframe. All right, she said. To the room, to her father, to the girl on the floor. All right. She turned the lamp down and walked out. Nathaniel was waiting at the end of the hall. He looked at her face and read what was there, the way he always did, accurately and without asking her to explain it. He held out his hand. She took it. They walked out of the house together. And the Virginia night was clear and cold and full of stars. And ahead of them was a 4-day road back to Kentucky. Back to Harrow Hill, back to the drainage channels, and the spring planting, and the vendor negotiations, and the life she had built out of the rubble of the life that had been taken from her. Back to Ruth and Elias and Tom Reardon and Rosalie at the second desk. Back to everything she had made. The carriage ride home was different from any of the ones that had come before it. They didn't talk about business or drainage or accounts. They talked the way people talked when they were inside something they'd built together, loosely, without agenda, following the conversation wherever it went. She told him about Clara Pratt's face when she'd said, "I pay attention." He told her about a conversation he'd had with old Mr. Whitfield, who had apparently spent the entirety of their discussion trying to understand how a woman had found fraud that 2 different accountants had missed, and had arrived at the conclusion that she must be unusually lucky. Unusually lucky, Vivian repeated, his word. I spent 3 hours in those ledgers, I know, Nathaniel said. He'll figure it out eventually. Or he won't, she said. Either way, it doesn't change the ledger. He looked at her across the carriage with that quality of attention she'd had 9 months to get used to, and still felt each time like the first time. No, he said. It doesn't. She looked out at the dark countryside and thought about all the ways things changed, and all the ways they didn't, and about the parts of the story that were finished, and the parts that were just beginning. The Coleman restitution would finish paying out in 3 years. The school would open in the fall. The eastern fields would yield their first proper spring harvest in a month. Rosalie would go back to Kentucky with them, to her desk and her ledgers, and the work she was learning to love. And Harrow Hill would keep becoming what Vivian had seen in it from the very first morning, what it had always been capable of. What it had simply needed someone to look at it with clear eyes and the willingness to rebuild from the inside out. She thought about what the county would say about the Hawthorne name. 5 years from now, she thought about the Virginia school. About the daughters of families like hers, learning in that room what she'd had to teach herself on that floor. About how a thing that had been used to diminish could be turned, deliberately and with intention, into something that lifted instead. She thought about a church corridor and a bouquet in the mud and a man who had walked through a door and asked for the right person by name. She thought, this is where the story changes, not where it ends. Not a finish line. A shift in direction so complete and so definitive that everything before it existed in a different chapter belonged to a different woman or the same woman in an earlier version of herself. The version that was still learning what she was worth. She knew now. Not because someone had told her. Not because Nathaniel had chosen her. Though he had. Not because she'd beaten Coleman or won the county's regard or built a drainage ditch that worked. Because she had done the work. Because she had sat at desks by lamplight and walked fields at dawn and carried 14-page documents into rooms full of people who expected her to be decorative. And she had laid those documents down and said, here is what I found. And here is what it means, and I will stand behind every figure on every page. That was who she was. That was who she had always been. Long before anyone was willing to see it. And the greatest thing Nathaniel Hawthorne had ever done for her was not choosing her in a church in Virginia. It was coming home to Harrow Hill every evening and sitting across a desk from her and treating the work she did as exactly what it was: real, significant, worth his complete attention. He had not saved her. He had given her the room to be exactly what she already was. And she had done the rest herself. The carriage rolled through the Kentucky dark toward home. And Vivian Hawthorne sat with her hand in her husband's hand, and her mind already moving toward morning, toward the spring planting, and the vendor letters, and the audit follow-up, and the school's founding documents that still needed 2 signatures. And a dozen other things that were hers to manage. Hers to build, hers to make right. She was not the woman they had left standing in a corridor. She was not the woman they had replaced at her own altar. She was not the plain one, the overlooked one, the one who couldn't be what the powerful men required. She was Vivian Caldwell Hawthorne, the woman who had looked at a failing estate and seen what it could become. Who had found fraud in 3 hours that others had missed for years. Who had turned a study full of grief into a school full of possibility. Who had built something real and lasting out of the worst morning of her life. And every person who had ever looked past her, every one of them, would spend the rest of their lives watching what she made. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.